The hum of printers and the steady clack of keyboards filled the 12th floor of Arlington and Company, one of the city's most respected firms. Employees bustled between cubicles, arms full of reports, their heads bent toward glowing screens. The air carried that familiar mix of caffeine and deadlines, the heartbeat of corporate life. Amid the rush, the glass doors slid open, and a young black man in a sharp, navy blue suit stepped inside. His polished shoes tapped softly against the marble as he crossed the lobby. A slim leather laptop bag hung from his shoulder, and in his hand he carried a sleek black notebook. His presence was calm, confident, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. He walked past the cubicles, greeting a few employees with polite nods. Some looked up curiously, returning the gesture, while others simply carried on with their work. His demeanor was professional, his steps purposeful, as he moved toward the large, glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. There, sunlight poured in from floor-to-ceiling windows, casting bright streaks across the long mahogany table inside. He paused briefly at the doorway, checking the time on his watch, before placing his bag on the chair closest to the head of the table. From the notebook, he pulled a few neatly folded documents, arranging them with the precision of someone who was not only prepared, but expected to be there. Around him, whispers began to stir. A few employees glanced up from their desks, exchanging puzzled looks. They didn't recognize him, at least not as one of their colleagues. And in an office where every face was familiar, an unfamiliar one sparked questions. But Marcus, as he was called, remained unbothered. He adjusted his tie, opened his notebook, and began reviewing his notes as if the conference room, the office, and the company itself were exactly where he belonged. He didn't yet know that his very presence had already attracted the wrong kind of attention. From across the office floor, Richard Harlow, a mid-level manager with a reputation for sharp elbows and sharper opinions, noticed the unfamiliar figure moving confidently toward the conference room. His eyes narrowed. Richard prided himself on knowing every person who reported under him, every intern, every analyst, every assistant. To see a young black man in an expensive suit, setting himself up at the large conference table, struck him as out of place, out of order. He leaned toward a colleague in the next cubicle, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the disdain. "Do you know that guy?" The colleague, a woman hunched over her monitor, glanced briefly toward the conference room and shrugged. "No idea. Maybe he's from another department?" Richard snorted. "Not a chance. I know the department heads. He's not one of them. Probably wandered in thinking he could use the space. Some people—" His words trailed into a mutter as his jaw tightened. The woman shifted uncomfortably, clearly not sharing his suspicion, but said nothing. She returned to her screen, trying to drown out the tension she felt creeping into the air. Richard, however, couldn't let it go. He watched as Marcus laid out his documents, calm and collected, as though he belonged at that table more than anyone else. The sight gnawed at him. In his mind, authority had to be earned, and he had already decided Marcus hadn't earned it. He straightened his tie, rose from his chair, and muttered, "Well, I'll sort this out." As he made his way across the office floor, several employees looked up from their screens, sensing the storm gathering. The murmur of keyboards and phones softened. The atmosphere shifted. Richard's stride carried the kind of arrogance that usually preceded trouble, and though Marcus remained unaware of the eyes fixed on him, the moment Richard pushed open the conference room door, the quiet dignity of preparation was about to be shattered by suspicion. The glass door to the conference room swung open with a sharp hiss as Richard pushed his way inside. The thud of it hitting the stopper made Marcus glance up from his notebook. His pen paused mid-line. Richard planted himself at the head of the table, arms folded across his chest, chin lifted. His voice was loud enough to carry beyond the glass walls, ensuring the nearby cubicles could hear. "Who are you and what exactly do you think you're doing in here?" Marcus set his pen down carefully, his expression composed. "I'm preparing for a meeting," he replied evenly. "I have business to attend to." Richard scoffed, his laugh short and sharp. "Business? This is a restricted space. You don't just wander in off the street and make yourself comfortable like you own the place?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, not rising to the provocation. "I didn't wander in. I was invited." But Richard pressed forward, his voice growing harsher, tinged with irritation. Invited by who? What department are you even with? I know all the team leads here, and you're not one of them. So let's cut the act before I call security. Through the glass, heads began to turn. Employees at nearby desks pretended to type, but their eyes lingered, ears tuned to every word. The tension spread quickly, silence rippling outward from the conference room. Marcus clasped his hands calmly on the table, refusing to mirror the hostility thrown at him. His voice was low, steady, and measured. I suggest you lower your tone. The calmness only fueled Richard's temper. His face flushed, his voice rising even higher. Lower my tone? I'm the manager here. I don't need to lower anything. What I need is for you to pack up your things and get out before this gets ugly. The words echoed across the office floor, harsh and heavy. And as Marcus sat quietly, composed in the storm of Richard's shouting, the scene drew in even more silent witnesses. Everyone watching knew something was about to break. Richard's voice carried like a whip, cracking through the glass walls of the conference room and rippling across the entire office floor. Employees shifted uneasily in their chairs, pretending to work while stealing glances toward the unfolding scene. The tension was magnetic. No one could look away. Marcus remained seated, his expression calm, his pen resting neatly across the open page of his notebook. His stillness only seemed to provoke Richard further. Don't just sit there staring at me, Richard barked, his finger jabbing toward Marcus. You don't belong in this room, and you sure as hell don't belong in this company. You think because you've got a fancy suit and a briefcase, you can just stroll in here like you're important? Not on my watch. The words rang with venom. A few employees nearby winced. One young analyst mouthed, "Wow," to her colleague, while another dropped his gaze quickly back to his screen, too nervous to intervene. Marcus inhaled slowly, his patience unbroken, though he felt the weight of humiliation pressing against his chest. He could see his reflection in the polished table, composed, dignified, unshaken, and clung to that steadiness. I don't owe you an explanation, he said at last, his voice quiet but clear. Richard's face flushed a deeper red. The arrogance. You come into my office and tell me you don't owe me anything? You're done. I'll have security drag you out of here in 5 minutes. People like you... He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. The silence outside the room thickened. No one moved. The hostility was undeniable now, and everyone could feel it. Marcus straightened in his chair, locking eyes with Richard. His tone carried no anger, only quiet strength. Be careful what you say next. But Richard, blinded by his own certainty, leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a near snarl. You're nothing here. Do you understand me? Nothing. Gasps sounded faintly from the hallway, and at that exact moment, the click of leather shoes on tile announced a new arrival. Heads turned. The atmosphere shifted. The CEO had entered the room. The door to the conference room eased open, and a hush fell over the office. Charles Whitmore, the CEO of Arlington and Company, stepped inside. Tall and silver-haired, dressed in a tailored gray suit, he carried the kind of presence that silenced rooms without a word. His calm gaze swept across the table, landing first on Richard, whose face had gone from crimson with anger to pale with unease. Richard, the CEO said smoothly, his voice steady but cool. What exactly is going on here? Richard straightened, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. Ah, Mr. Whitmore, thank goodness. I was just handling a situation. This man, he gestured sharply at Marcus, decided to help himself to your conference room. I was about to call security. The words stumbled awkwardly from his mouth, suddenly lacking the bravado he'd worn moments earlier. Outside the glass walls, the office was nearly still. Employees hovered in silence, straining to hear every word. Whitmore's eyes shifted toward Marcus. And then, for the first time that morning, the CEO's expression softened. His lips curved into a faint smile, one of recognition, not reprimand. Is that so? He asked mildly, his gaze flicking back to Richard. You were about to call security on him? Richard chuckled nervously, tugging at his tie. Well, yes, sir. He was sitting in here like he owned the place. The CEO let the words linger, then nodded slowly. Interesting choice of words. He moved toward the table with a measured stride, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. As he approached, Marcus stood, straightening his jacket with calm composure. The two men clasped hands firmly, the warmth of familiarity in their gesture. Whitmore's voice rang out clearly, deliberately loud enough for those outside the room to hear. Marcus doesn't just sit in this conference room because he feels like it. He sits here because he belongs here. In fact, the CEO turned, his gaze sweeping the employees gathered outside. His words meant for everyone as much as for Richard. He's my business partner. A ripple of astonished gasps spread across the office. Whispered disbelief gave way to silence again, the weight of revelation crashing down on Richard like a hammer. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. His very presence, validated by the CEO's words, spoke volumes. Richard's mouth fell open, but no explanation came. Richard's face drained of color, his jaw tightening as murmurs rippled through the rows of cubicles outside. The weight of the CEO's words pressed down on him like a stone. Business partner. The phrase echoed in his mind, louder than the heartbeat pounding in his ears. Charles Whitmore clasped Marcus's shoulder with an easy familiarity, the kind reserved for equals. Everyone, the CEO continued, his voice calm but carrying authority, meet Marcus Reed, my partner and co-owner of this company. Half of what you see here exists because of him. The office floor fell into stunned silence. Employees gaped openly, some exchanging shocked glances, others quickly dropping their eyes to their keyboards, embarrassed by their earlier assumptions. Richard stumbled for words, his arrogance crumbling into desperation. Mr. Whitmore, I didn't realize— You didn't ask, the CEO interrupted, his gaze cutting through Richard like glass. Instead, you judged. Loudly, publicly, and wrongly, Richard's throat tightened. I thought he was— He stopped himself, realizing any excuse would only dig him deeper. Marcus, who had stood in dignified silence, finally spoke, his tone measured and calm. What you thought doesn't matter. What matters is how you treated me. You spoke to me as if I had no right to be here, and in doing so, you revealed far more about yourself than about me. A few employees outside the glass nodded subtly, their eyes flicking toward Richard with quiet disapproval. The humiliation burned on his skin, hotter with each second that passed. Whitmore turned to the manager again, his tone even but firm. Let me make this perfectly clear. In this company, respect is not negotiable. Titles, suits, assumptions, none of that gives you the right to diminish another person. Do you understand? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, sir. Good, the CEO said, before glancing at Marcus with a small, approving nod. Now, let's get back to business. The kind that actually matters. With that, he gestured for Marcus to take his rightful seat at the head of the table. Marcus did so with quiet confidence, the room now his in every sense. Richard stood awkwardly to the side, trapped in silence, his authority shattered before the very people he once commanded. The hum of the office seemed to return slowly, though it was different now. Hushed, reverent, uneasy. Employees sat straighter at their desks, their eyes darting between the conference room and Richard, who stood like a man carved in stone, still reeling from the blow of humiliation. Inside the room, Marcus adjusted the papers he had laid out earlier, his movements calm, precise, deliberate. He had no need to gloat, no need to raise his voice. His very presence, validated, respected, and honored, was its own victory. Charles Whitmore remained standing, his hand resting lightly on the back of Marcus's chair. He turned toward the employees beyond the glass, ensuring his words reached not only Richard, but everyone within earshot. This company was built on partnership, on trust, and on respect, he said, his voice carrying like a bell across the floor. And let me make this absolutely clear. Disrespect has no place here. Not toward a colleague, not toward a client, and certainly not toward my partner. His gaze lingered on Richard for a heartbeat longer before sweeping back across the room. We succeed because we bring people together. That means every voice, every talent, every perspective is valued. If you can't uphold that, you don't belong here. The silence was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was full of realization, a reckoning. Heads nodded quietly. Some eyes widened with shame. Others with a newfound respect for the man, now seated at the head of the table. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his authority drained, his reputation fractured. For once, he had nothing to say. Marcus finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. Respect isn't a courtesy. It's a requirement. Today was a reminder of that. He closed his notebook and leaned back slightly in his chair, his presence commanding without effort. The CEO gave him a small nod of approval, then addressed the room one final time. Now let's do what we came here to do. Build something worth being proud of. And with that, the meeting began. But for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation, the real lesson had already been learned. The day would be remembered not for the numbers on the spreadsheets, but for the moment a man who was shouted down as an outsider took his rightful place as an owner, a leader, and a partner, while the manager who tried to belittle him was left to reckon with the weight of his own prejudice.